child until he received the MMR at 16 months, following which he had a seizure and was diagnosed as having pervasive developmental delay, which is a diagnosis consistent with the diagnosis of autism. The next omnibus case was of Yates Hazelhurst. He was developing normally until receiving the MMR 3 days before his first birthday, and he regressed into autism. All of the questionable evidence in the Cedillo case was used in the Hazelhurst case. The YouTube video on this page is very much worth watching. Hannah Poling was a healthy child until receiving vaccines at 19 months, after which she developed encephalopathy and was left with deficits consistent with autism. The government conceded the Poling case, acknowledging that her autism was caused by a vaccine injury. Once again, she was to have been the fourth test case in the omnibus proceeding, and by conceding the Poling case, the government prevented Dr. Andrew Zimmerman's opinion for her case from being used in the full omnibus proceeding. 4 months later, the government concession of the Poling case was leaked to the media, and the parents of Hannah Poling filed for a motion of complete transparency, but this was opposed by the Department of Justice. Here is the decision by the court deferring a ruling on the motion for transparency. About a year and a half after being heard, the court ruled against the test cases and thus against the 5,000 omnibus cases, while in separate hearings, that for Bailey Banks and Hannah Poling, a special master had ruled the opposite. The Hazelhurst case was appealed, but the appeal was denied, and it was stated by an attorney involved that the Department of Justice willfully and intentionally concealed critical material evidence, and if this had been done in a court of law, a lawyer would face disbarment and criminal charges. Subsequently, an article has been published using public records and found 83 cases of autism compensated by the vaccine court. And since the vast majority of cases remain sealed, this likely represents a fraction of the total. The U.S. Supreme Court has reaffirmed the immunity granted to pharmaceutical companies even for design defects in a vaccine. By 2013, the U.S. government had paid more than $2.5 billion to families of vaccine-injured children. What would it have been if the omnibus proceeding had been decided differently? What do we say to parents about vaccine safety? Hygiene versus vaccines. The authors of Dissolving Illusions make a case that living conditions, not vaccines, are responsible for the decreases we've seen in disease. One of the authors, Suzanne Humphreys, is speaking and making videos about vaccines, and our patients are watching and listening. You might want to listen to her opinions. They are thought-provoking, and at the very least you should know what information your patients are hearing. Measles mortality had declined by more than 98% and whooping cough by more than 90% before the introduction of vaccines. And diseases for which there were no vaccines have also declined during this period. By the time the pertussis vaccine was introduced in England, the mortality was 1% of the rate it had been 50 years before. Today, most outbreaks of whooping cough are in vaccinated people. This is a graph of pertussis mortality since 1900, showing when the vaccine was introduced. And this is a graph of measles mortality, again showing when the vaccine was introduced. In Boston, more died from smallpox after compulsory vaccination than in the 20 years prior. With compulsory smallpox vaccination in England, deaths from smallpox increased. Some observers felt that the vaccinated did worse than the non-vaccinated. The Leicester example. Leicester, England stopped compulsory vaccination in 1885 outsiders warned of terrible consequences, but Leicester continued to have much better success against smallpox than other towns that were highly vaccinated. An Australian physician wrote about the introduction of smallpox vaccine in the Philippines. Since its introduction, case mortality increased alarmingly. The mortality is hardly explainable. We have had a decline in disease. How much is due to better living conditions? How much from vaccines? Herd immunity. What exactly is herd immunity, and what is the evidence that herd immunity is needed to control a disease? Herd immunity is used to justify compulsory vaccination, and the idea is that 95% coverage is needed in order to control a disease. So are parents who don't vaccinate their children putting their children and everybody else at risk by reducing herd immunity? And where does the idea come from that 95% vaccination levels are needed to provide this immunity? Here are 4 articles on herd immunity. The 1923 article is the first mention I could find for herd immunity. The 1930 article used the 95% number, noting that when 95% of children had had the disease, there was a 2 to 3 year pause before the next epidemic. The 1983 article claimed that greater than 90% immunity for measles did not prevent epidemics, and the 1993 article noted the complexity of the issue and the lack of simple answers. Does measles vaccine provide herd immunity? It didn't in this outbreak in South Africa, or in this one in Missouri, or in Colorado, or in Quebec, or in Montana, or in Brazil. Does vaccination create a risk to newborns? The immunity provided to newborns from mothers who have had the disease is better than the immunity from vaccinated mothers. Infants whose mothers were vaccinated had a higher attack rate as compared to older mothers who had had the disease. This article concluded that vaccination might increase the proportion of infants susceptible to measles. Does measles vaccination provide herd immunity? Apparently not, given the number of outbreaks in fully vaccinated or nearly fully vaccinated populations. Because the vaccine immunity wears off, to have even the theoretical possibility of achieving herd immunity, we would need to give boosters periodically to everyone who has not had the natural disease. And what about chickenpox? This researcher noted that chickenpox vaccine is less effective than natural immunity in that vaccination is not cost-effective. Increased shingles morbidity has offset any cost savings. Other articles on the same issue. Should we be vaccinating for chickenpox? Does the chickenpox vaccine provide an overall benefit to our population? Does pertussis vaccination provide herd immunity? This study found that the highest incidence of disease in a California outbreak was among previously vaccinated children. The unvaccinated did not contribute significantly to the increased rate of clinical pertussis, although many blamed them for the outbreak. Is herd immunity justification for compulsory vaccination? One can make a good argument that it isn't. Why do we vaccinate for mumps? Separate measles and rubella vaccines were once available. The Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization uses the measles rubella, not the MMR. And single vaccines were once available, but Merck stopped their production in 2009. The case for vaccination for mumps was never compelling, and it can be argued that adding mumps to the measles rubella may transform mumps from an insignificant disease to a significant one. The immunity after mumps vaccine is temporary, and delaying the onset of mumps may increase the risk to men for orchitis and infertility, and the effectiveness of the vaccine is debatable since there continue to be mumps outbreaks despite vaccination. There was a prolonged outbreak in a vaccinated population in Australia. Here is an outbreak in a vaccinated population in Kansas. And here is one in Virginia, and one in Belgium, and one in Canada. And this article describes outbreaks that were not prevented despite vaccination. Why do we have the MMR if we don't need the mumps vaccine? It has been claimed that Merck added mumps to market their vaccine over rivals, not for any perceived need. A Merck representative convinced Massachusetts to mandate the MMR, and other states followed suit. Did the CDC approve the MMR without justification of need for the mumps component? You might find it interesting that Merck is currently being sued for fraud. The accusation is that Merck willfully and illegally maintained its monopoly through its ongoing manipulation of the reported efficacy of its mumps vaccine. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the details. Should we be vaccinating for mumps? Let's talk about the recent CDC whistleblower. William Thompson has stated that the CDC had purposely omitted data showing a connection of the MMR to autism. African American boys who received the MMR vaccine before age 36 months were at increased risk for autism. Brian Hooker was able to access the omitted data and found the statistically significant increase in autism cases.